Let's talk about possibly the hardest job ever made in Final Fantasy XIV, complete with both MP management, long cast times, and absolutely brutal job mechanics. Of course, you read the video title, and I am talking about none other than the Black Mage. In this video, we'll go over the history of the Black Mage job, all the way from A Realm Reborn to where it is now, and compare how the job changed through the years. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Black Mage job itself, there are two core mechanics, particularly relevant to Black Mage, that worked very differently back in A Realm Reborn. The first of which being the party bonus. These days, there is a direct incentive to bring at least one of every role, because each unique role represented grants the raid a blanket plus 1% to all attributes. Before Shadowbringers, however, this worked differently. Instead, each role represented a specific attribute and granted a 3% bonus to that attribute for being present. This meant, for example, that having a bard present would boost everyone's dexterity by 3%, which isn't particularly helpful for a Black Mage, although apparently this attribute also increased your block and parry rate. Bringing a Black Mage or a Summoner to your party granted everyone 3% more intelligence, which was particularly relevant because healers' damage output was dependent on intelligence back then. As such, it was worthwhile to bring at least one mage to every group, just for that. The second mechanic is in regards to the piety stat. Before Shadowbringers, piety instead increased your maximum MP, was considered an attribute like strength, and was accessible to all jobs. How commonly the attribute was found on gear accessible and worthwhile to a Black Mage I do not know, probably none. However, this did mean that there was a possibility that how many fire spells you could cast in succession could vary from Black Mage to Black Mage, and could very well vary based on equipment. The fact that your MP varied also meant it was a lot more complicated to keep track of precisely how many more spells you had MP to cast. Take note that back before Shadowbringers, materia for attributes also existed, and jewelry typically came with little to no attributes on them. This meant that using intelligence materia, or even piety materia, was absolutely an option for a Black Mage. Now, there are certainly more weird features from back in A Realm Reborn, like sprint costing TP, however, most of these are not super significant for a Black Mage, so we will skip over those. With that out of the way, let's look at this strange history of the Black Mage, starting with A Realm Reborn. Let's start with Umbral Ice and Astral Fire. While the documentation is very limited, it appears that the base effects of the buffs are mostly the same as they are now. The main differences being that they don't affect the other element's cast times, but instead just cut the cost and damage of the opposite element in half. Presumably, Umbral Ice still recovered 30, 45 and 60% MP per tick back then, and Astral Fire increased damage by 40, 60 and 80%. Additionally, the second stack was learned at level 20, as it is now, and the third stack was learned at level 40, which caused some interesting issues all the way up to and including Shadowbringers. Finally, both of these buffs only lasted a measly 10 seconds in A Realm Reborn. A far more fascinating detail is that Blizzard 1 used to apply a 40% heavy debuff for 20 seconds in addition to its other effects. Transpose also had a 12-second cooldown, so when you switched over, you might actually either have to cast your way into the other element manually, or be stuck where you are for a bit. More importantly, Transpose's cooldown being longer than the duration of the buff meant you couldn't actually keep a buff up out of combat or without attacking. Thunder 1, 2 and 3 were also actually all natural upgrades for each other, you would think. Thunder 1 lasted 4 ticks and had a 2.5 second cast time. 2 lasted 5 ticks with a 3 second cast time, and 3 lasted 6 ticks and had a 3.5 second cast time. Note that none of them were AoE. Thundercloud also had only a 5% chance to activate. This means that, naturally, you'd want to use Thundercloud with Thunder 3 only, but while you were in Umbral Ice recovering MP, both Thunder 1, 2 and 3 are all worth applying to a target. Yes, they stacked. Speaking of procs, Firestarter also worked the same as it does now, although only with a 30% chance, and both Thundercloud and Firestarter had around 12 seconds to be used, which wasn't changed until Endwalker. Note that, as the third stack of Umbral Ice and Astral Fire was learned at level 40, but Fire 3 and Blizzard 3 were learned at level 34 and 38 respectively, there was a level range where these spells felt somewhat pointless due to their cast times, cost and payoff. Fire 2 and Flare also worked mostly as they do now, although Fire 2 grants Astral Fire in the same way as Fire 1, didn't boost Flare, and Flare does its full damage to all targets, and the area of effect is almost twice as large as it is now. Whether Flare could be cast with as little as 8% of your MP to spare, I could not determine. Which covers the basic toolkit of the Black Mage, leading us to all the utility, and you might feel a bunch of things are missing, which is understandable. Blizzard 2 did respectable AoE damage, yes, but it was centered on yourself. While the cast time was shorter than Blizzard 1 and the potency made it worth using on just 2 targets, the fact that you had to come into melee range made it very inconvenient to use. Additionally, Blizzard 2 also caused Bind for 4 seconds. Freeze, similarly, was a lot more awkward to use back then, with a huge 3.5 second cast time, ground targeting, and a pathetic 20 potency AoE. It also caused a 15-second bind on all targets, but I wonder if this was actually useful back then even, given other utility you had available. Sleep was a single target spell, but Black Mages learned a trait that made it an area of effect, just like it is now. Scathe, shockingly, is completely unchanged from today. Yes, even the same potency. For defensive utility, Mana Ward existed back then too, and surprisingly, also didn't cost MP back then either. Mana Font, on the other hand, was called Convert and cost 20% HP to use. Ethereal Manipulation also worked exactly as it does now, except it had a 3-minute cooldown. Yes, 3 minutes. And while we're on the subject of absurdly long cooldowns for simple things, Swiftcast also was a 3-minute cooldown. Surecast instead only prevented spell interruption for one spell on a short 30-second cooldown, and you even got a trait that sometimes allowed you to skip the cooldown entirely. Remember, the act of casting Surecast still would delay your next spell due to weaving. Lethargy was an ability that both slowed movement and attack speed by 20% for 12 seconds on a 30-second cooldown, which might be helpful, especially if it worked on bosses. Mana Wall also was a 2-minute cooldown that nullified 2 physical hits within 60 seconds, which, in the right context, sounds absolutely insane. And finally, Apocatastasis, try saying that 3 times fast, applied a 12-second fire, ice and lightning resistance buff on a 2-minute cooldown, but weirdly also prevented the target from being affected by this buff again for 1 minute. I am very curious as to the reasoning for this stipulation, but I suppose it was to prevent degenerate strategies involving multiple Black Mages. Oh, also, Apocatastasis could not be used on yourself. And then there were the cross-class actions. In A Realm Reborn, cross-class actions were a handful of options you could unlock by leveling other classes up to use on your current job. By level 50, you would be allowed to pick up to 5 amongst the set list of actions. Black Mage specifically had a few to choose from Archer and Arcanist, totaling 7 different choices. Unfortunately, 2 of them were practically pointless. Ruin was a weaker spell than even Blizzard 1, so Black Mage had no reason to ever choose it, and Hawk's Eye boosted physical accuracy, which Black Mage didn't need. Fun fact, Black Mages always do 1 damage with their auto attacks. This leaves 5 options, all of which were at least viable. Raging Strikes boosted damage by a massive 20% for 20 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown and was an obvious pick. Quelling Strikes reduced enmity generated for 15 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown, which was a lot more helpful before Shadowbringers than it is now. Eye for an Eye put a long 30-second buff that, whenever the target is hit, had a 20% chance to apply a 10% damage down effect on the attacker for 20 seconds. Quite potent. Virus, which had an icon reminiscent of today's Cradle, reduced strength and dexterity for 10 seconds on a 90-second cooldown, but it was a spell. And finally, Physic technically is a spell available to Black Mages, but as you may well know, Physic scales with Mind. Which means unless you had a reasonable amount of mind, the fact it was available to you wasn't actually very helpful. With all of these actions, I imagine the primary gameplay of Black Mage back in A Realm Reborn revolved around casting Fire 3 to enter Astral Fire, and casting Fire 1 repeatedly, using Fire 3 with Firestarter and Thunder 3 should a Thundercloud proc come up. Then, when close out of MP, use Blizzard 3 to switch to Ice, and then use Thunder 1, 2 and 3 to reapply the dots, and Blizzard 1 to keep Umbral Ice up if necessary. For AoE, I imagine Fire 3 and Fire 2 would be used, and of course Flare. Whether repeatedly applying Thunder 3 to everything was a viable strategy, I'm uncertain. With the release of Heavensward, a handful of things changed for the Black Mage. Blizzard 2's potency was cut in half, but its bind duration was doubled, although this actually made it less useful rather than more useful, even more so when Freeze's potency was increased to 100 potency. All 3 Thunders got 2 extra ticks to their dots, massively increasing the Thundercloud proc's damage, and Thundercloud's proc chance was increased to 10%, and Swiftcast's cooldown was reduced to 1 minute. Ethereal Manipulation also had its cooldown reduced to just 30 seconds. Apocatastasis had its buff adjusted to be just 20% magic damage reduction, but otherwise the effect is unchanged. Mana Wall was also adjusted to just block physical damage equal to 20% HP. Flare was changed to do 10% less damage to each subsequent target, down to 50%, meaning by 6 targets, the 6th target would only take half damage. For new actions, Leylines had only 90 seconds of cooldown, and rather than reducing cast times, increased cast speed, which sounds like it is the same, but the significant difference is that this is equivalent to 13% reduced cast times. Note, however, that if you left the Leylines at all, they would disappear prematurely. Sharpcast works as it does in Endwalker, just with a only 10-second duration and 1 minute cooldown. Enochian was a very different beast back then, and the primary reason why Black Mage was considered such a brutally difficult job, if Leylines disappearing if you had to move wasn't reason enough. Enochian had a 1 minute cooldown and a 30-second duration, and boosted your magic damage by 5% and enabled Fire 4 and Blizzard 4 to use. Note that it only had a 50% uptime as is. Blizzard 4 and Fire 4 also had 3-second cast times compared to Endwalkers 2.8. Now, rather than granting Umbral Hearts as it does today, Blizzard 4 instead reset Enochian, albeit with a 5-second shorter duration. This effect compounded so the third application would only last 20 seconds, for example. Fire 4 on the other hand simply did an absurd amount of damage. This of course meant that the gameplay loop of Black Mage was to enter Astral Fire with a fresh Enochian and as much MP as possible, and fit as many Fire 4s as you could. Remember, Astral Fire still only lasted 10 seconds. So typically, you could only fit 2 Fire 4s per Fire 1. On average, Black Mages had approximately relatively the same MP back then as we do now, meaning that without Umbral Hearts, you could afford either 6 Fire 4s, 1 Fire 1, or 5 Fire 4s and 2 Fire 1s, if Convert was available at least. According to this old flowchart, the only consistent way to cast 6 Fire 4s appeared to involve letting Astral Fire drop entirely and use a Firestarter proc to continue. Notably, Enochian didn't drop if you lost Astral Fire back then. When you were close to out of MP, you then switched to Umbral Ice with Blizzard 3, and when Enochian was about to run out, you used Blizzard 4 to continue. Given that the cooldown of Enochian was 60 seconds, you needed to extend this buff manually with Blizzard 4 at least twice before the ability itself was an option. Naturally, as the Thunder dots still appeared to stack, dropping them all on the enemy during Umbral Ice still appeared to be a strategy, although I wonder if it was worth casting Thunder 1 and 2 with the limited time you had, needing to cast Blizzard 3 and 4 also during the ice downtime. Before moving on, I want to add that at some point during Heavensward, it appears the duration of Umbral Ice and Astral Fire was increased to 12 seconds. When exactly this happened, I couldn't find. This then leads us on to Stormblood, meaning the loss of cross-class actions and the introduction of the role actions, but also the introduction of job gauges. Yes, that's Stormblood. With the loss of cross-class actions, we mainly lose Raging Strikes, and pretty much all the other actions were mostly just there, although Quelling Strikes was neat for enmity management. With the introduction of role actions, the Black Mage got access to a handful of new tools. Like cross-class actions, you could pick 5, and Black Mage's options included Addle, reducing intelligence and mind by 10% as an ability, Diversion, which was basically Quelling Strikes, Lucid Dreaming, which also cut all your enmity in half while recovering MP on a 2-minute cooldown. Swiftcast and Apocatastasis also came over as they are. Surecast had its knockback immunity added, but otherwise unchanged. In addition to these, we also got Break, doing meh damage but applying a 20% heavy for 20 seconds. Drain, which did slightly more damage while also healing the Black Mage. Mana Shift, which allowed you to pass 20% of your max MP to someone else, which was an incredible utility for Black Mages. And finally Erase, which removed a dot on someone else while also healing them a bit as an ability. The obvious choices for Black Mages were Swiftcast, Lucid Dreaming, Mana Shift, Diversion and Surecast, which means that you had to lose something useful if you needed something else from the list, meaning that this new system was significantly more interesting than cross-class actions were, at least for Black Mages. For the Black Mage's own actions, Blizzard 1 no longer applies a 40% heavy, which, let's be real, was a bit insane anyway. In addition to that, Lethargy and Mana Wall were also removed, which is somewhat understandable with Break being a worse Lethargy and Mana Wall being a bit odd presented alongside Mana Ward. With the release of Stormblood, the duration of Umbral Ice and Astral Fire were also increased to 13 seconds, and shortly before Shadowbringers' release it was further increased to 15 seconds. Note that Stormblood also introduced a mechanic where Astral Fire and Umbral Ice 3 cut the cast time of the opposite element in half. Firestarter's proc rate was increased to 40%, Thunder Dodge no longer stack, Thunder 2 is turned into an AoE option, and Thunder 3 now naturally overrides Thunder 1 when learned, and Thundercloud's proc rate for Thunder 2 is set to 3%. Flare's damage drop-off per target was further increased to 15%, and a bottom limit of 70% reduction. Fire 2 also having its damage reduced slightly meant that Fire 2 was still entirely worse than Flare. Leylines was adjusted to now actually reduce cast times as it does in Endwalker, and the circle no longer disappears if you leave the circle. Sharpcast's duration is now 15 seconds and Enochian's duration is now infinite, as long as Astral Fire or Umbral Ice stays up. The cooldown of Enochian was also reduced to 30 seconds as well. Fire 4 and Blizzard 4 also had their cast times reduced to 2.8 seconds, and Blizzard 4 now grants 3 Umbral Hearts that nullify the cost increase of Astral Fire instead of extending Enochian. Oh right, and Sleep's trait that made it AoE was actually removed, making it single target. It is also worth pointing out that Blizzard 3 is now learned at level 40. For new actions, Between the Lines works exactly as an Endwalker. Thunder 4 replaces Thunder 2, but given the properties of Thunder 4, it was closer to an AoE Thunder 1 in effect and duration. Triplecast also works as it does in Endwalker, and Foul is introduced alongside the Polyglots system. Foul had a drop-off system similar to the Flare of Heavensward. The introduction of Foul was also given alongside a boost to Enochian's magic damage bonus. Umbral Hearts was also allowed to cause Flare to only cost 2/3 of your MP if you had Umbral Hearts. Overall, Black Mage is already starting to seem a lot like how it looks today, with the most significant differences being that you are in a pickle if you run completely out of MP, since Astral Fire and Umbral Ice still did not make the opposite element free. And with Shadowbringers, one particular feature significant for Black Mages is that our MP is set to a fixed 10,000 cap. With Shadowbringers, the role action system was also simplified greatly. We now only have 4 role actions left, with Addle, Swiftcast, Lucid Dreaming and Surecast, all of which are equipped with their Endwalker effects. Except Addle, which still lowers intelligence and mind. At some point during Stormblood, Transpose's cooldown was reduced to 8 seconds, and with Shadowbringers it was reduced further to 5 seconds. Blizzard 2 lost its binding effect, Convert was reworked to Mana Font, losing the HP cost, Freeze also lost its bind effect, and its ground targeting effect, and had it replaced with the ability to grant 1 Umbral Heart, unlocked alongside the Umbral Heart's interaction with Flare. Flare and Foul's damage drop-off on AoE were reworked to be a fixed percentage instead of a gradual drop-off. Ethereal Manipulation also finally had its cooldown reduced to 10 seconds. Sleep now also inherently is AoE again. For new actions, Despair, Umbral Soul and Xenoglossy are introduced with the exact effects as they are in Endwalker, granting an excellent fire finisher, Ice downtime option and mobility option, and Foul was made instant. We now also can hold 2 Polyglots. Sharpcast's cooldown was reduced further to 30 seconds, Enochian's magic damage bonus was increased further, and of course, Aspect Mastery meant that Astral Fire 3 and Umbral Ice 3 caused the opposite element to be completely free, which had a much more profound effect on Black Mage's AoE capabilities than single target, as this meant that Black Mages could now cast double flares very regularly, with no awkward downtimes waiting for an MP tick. However, aside from that, Shadowbringers mostly just highlighted how much quality of life the job gets as it levels up, making the job feel even more awkward at low level in contrast. And with Endwalker, at least some of this utility was passed down to new Black Mages. making Astral Fire 1 and Umbral Ice 1 cause the opposite element to be free. The third stack finally unlocked at level 35, and Blizzard 3 and Fire 3 being learned at this same level too. Blizzard 2 was also reworked to be a targeted AoE instead, and it and Fire 2 were granted the capacity to put you straight to 3 stacks of their buff. The duration of both Thundercloud and Firestarter were also set to 40 and 30 seconds respectively, giving the Black Mage a huge amount of freedom in when to use them. Flare's potency were also adjusted slightly, and Fire 2 was granted an ability to boost the potency of Flare to give Black Mages an incentive to use both actions. Enochian was also reworked to be just a completely passive effect now, and Leylines was adjusted to a 2-minute cooldown. For new actions, Blizzard 2 and Fire 2 upgraded to High Fire 2 and High Blizzard 2 for a potency boost. And Blizzard 1 and Fire 1 turns into the incredible Paradox under certain circumstances, greatly helping fill out any awkward drops remaining in the rotation. Enochian was also boosted further to a 21% magic damage bonus. Amplifier was also added to get an extra Polyglot every now and then, including the opener. It is also worth mentioning that Sleep was made into a role action. Black Mage's playstyle had an interesting journey to where it is today, with A Realm Reborn having a rotation reminiscent of the low-level rotation of Endwalker, just adding a lot of Thunder Dots to manage on top of it. Heavenswards Enochian sounds similar to how we manage Astral Fire today, trying to squeeze as many Fire 4s into the window as possible without casting Fire 1. This was, of course, also the case in Heavensward, but you just also had the Enochian timer to keep track of. And remember, both of these timers were simply buffs, as job gauges didn't exist yet at that point. And the Thunder Dot management was still there from A Realm Reborn. Then with Stormblood, most of what Black Mage is today was put into shape. 1 Thunder Dot, Enochian lasts as long as you don't mess up, Umbral Hearts and Polyglots. And then these mechanics were mostly built upon with Shadowbringers and Endwalker finally introducing Paradox, finally replacing Blizzard 1 and Fire 1 in the rotation. Now, I hope you found this trip through time interesting, nostalgic or enlightening, but either way, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, the damage over time component of spells like Thunder don't actually break crowd control effects like Sleep. This means that back in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, you could feasibly apply Thunder 1, 2 and 3 and then put an enemy to sleep, and then use all the Thundercloud procs to devastate a different enemy.